This story is inspired by the real rescue of little Klieber, who survived 6 days beneath the rubble in La Guaira, Venezuela. Some scenes have been dramatized for storytelling. If stories of courage, loyal dogs, and real hope inspire you, please consider subscribing, liking this video, and sharing it with someone who believes miracles can still happen. Your support helps us bring more unforgettable stories like this. Now, let's begin. They said no one could survive 6 days beneath a mountain of broken concrete. But sometimes hope refuses to listen to the voices of certainty. Dawn crept slowly across the shattered streets of Mérida, Venezuela, painting collapsed buildings in pale gold that felt almost cruel against so much silence. The air carried the scent of soaked dust, cracked stone, and fresh rain, while distant rescue sirens faded one by one as exhausted crews accepted what they believed was the end. Families stood behind safety barriers wrapped in thin blankets despite the warm tropical morning, staring toward the ruins with eyes that had forgotten how to expect miracles. One by one, emergency teams packed away ropes, medical bags, and thermal scanners. 6 days had passed since the earth shook with unimaginable force. Every textbook, every experienced rescuer, every statistic whispered the same heartbreaking conclusion. If anyone had remained trapped this long, they were almost certainly gone. Yet in the middle of that heavy silence stood one German shepherd who refused to surrender. Ranger was 5 years old, his sable coat dulled by layers of gray dust, his amber eyes fixed on the same collapsed apartment building he had circled since the first hours after the earthquake. His paws were scraped raw from clawing through loose concrete, but every few moments he returned to one narrow section of broken foundation, sniffed carefully, lowered his ears, and barked with quiet determination. It was never frantic, never random, just one deliberate bark after another, as though he were answering someone only he could hear. Former U.S. Marine Daniel Carter watched from several yards away without speaking. At 38, Daniel carried himself with the calm posture that years of service had carved into him. His broad shoulders were covered in a faded rescue jacket instead of military camouflage now, but discipline still lived in every movement. His weathered face showed lines earned beneath desert suns and endless deployments, while short brown hair dusted with gray-framed, thoughtful hazel eyes that rarely missed small details. The people around him saw another volunteer. Ranger saw something different. He saw the man who had once trusted him with life itself. Daniel had met Ranger 4 years earlier through a veterans canine rehabilitation program, after returning home, carrying wounds no one could see. They learned each other slowly. Daniel helped the dog believe people again, and Ranger quietly reminded the former Marine that not every mission ended in loss. Since then, they had responded to floods, wildfires, hurricanes, and missing person searches across the country. Daniel had learned one lesson above every other. Ranger never barked without a reason. A young engineer approached, removing his hard hat with weary hands. "Mr. Carter," he said gently, "we're shutting this sector down. The cranes are moving in within 30 minutes. The structure isn't stable anymore." Daniel nodded, but said nothing. His eyes remained on Ranger. The dog had stopped barking. Instead, he stood perfectly still with his nose pressed against a narrow crack between two slabs of concrete. His tail did not wag. His ears leaned forward. His entire body became motionless, as though listening to something buried beneath layers of silence. Around them, volunteers folded stretchers and loaded trucks. Reporters packed away cameras. Even the families began drifting toward buses prepared to carry them home with unanswered prayers. Then Ranger suddenly lifted his head and looked directly into Daniel's eyes. It was the same look Daniel had seen years ago overseas, just seconds before hidden danger revealed itself. No panique, no fear, only certainty. Daniel walked slowly toward him and knelt beside the fractured concrete. Dust settled around his boots. Warm morning wind carried the distant sound of church bells across the damaged city. He placed one steady hand on Ranger's shoulder and whispered softly, "If you still believe someone is waiting down there, old friend, then so do I." Far beneath the broken apartment building, where sunlight could not reach and time had begun to lose its meaning. 6-year-old Klieber opened his eyes to complete darkness once again. He did not know whether it was morning or evening anymore. He only knew that somewhere above him there had once been voices, engines, and footsteps. But now even those had faded into an endless stillness that made every heartbeat sound louder than the last. The narrow space surrounding him was barely large enough for him to stretch one arm at a time. A cracked concrete beam rested inches above his head, forming a tiny pocket that had become the only reason he was still alive. Cool drops of rainwater slipped through broken pipes overhead every few minutes, collecting along the edge of a fractured stone before falling into a shallow puddle beside him. Whenever he heard the gentle splash, he reached carefully with trembling fingers and gathered a few drops into his hands. It was never enough, but it was enough to keep hope breathing one more hour. His stomach ached with hunger, yet it was not hunger that frightened him anymore. It was the silence. Every so often he whispered, "Mama." The darkness answered with nothing except the quiet settling of distant debris. He wrapped both arms around his knees and remembered the morning before everything changed. His mother had laughed while making breakfast. The smell of warm bread had filled their apartment. His favorite blue toy truck still sat beside the window. He wondered if it was still there somewhere above him, or if it had disappeared along with everything else. Those memories became little lights inside his mind, brighter than the darkness surrounding him. Above the ruins, Daniel remained kneeling beside Ranger, while rescue supervisors finalized the evacuation of the search zone. A senior structural engineer approached with measured patience. "Daniel," he said quietly, "the foundation has shifted again. Another aftershock could happen at any moment. If we keep people here, we could lose rescuers." 2. Daniel looked at the cracked walls rising around them before turning back toward Ranger. The German Shepherd had not moved. His nose remained pressed against the same narrow opening. He inhaled slowly, then looked back at Daniel with unwavering focus. Daniel had learned long ago that Ranger communicated through the smallest changes. A wagging tail could mean excitement. A lowered head could signal uncertainty. But this stillness, this absolute certainty, only appeared when the dog trusted his own instincts completely. Daniel stood and walked toward the rescue command trailer where maps of the collapsed neighborhood covered folding tables. Volunteers removed colored markers one after another, indicating completed search sectors. The building where Ranger waited was already marked with a red circle, meaning operations were finished. Daniel reached for the marker and quietly drew one small question mark beside it. Several people noticed, but said nothing. Nearby, Emily Carter arrived carrying 2 bottles of water and fresh gloves for her husband. She had joined the humanitarian mission as a logistics coordinator and understood Daniel almost as well as Ranger did. She studied the dog for several seconds before speaking softly. "He has not looked anywhere else all morning." Daniel shook his head. "Not once." Emily followed Ranger's gaze toward the fractured concrete. "Do you think someone is really still alive?" Daniel answered without hesitation. "I think Ranger believes someone is." Emily smiled sadly because she had seen this partnership overcome impossible odds before. During flood rescues, Ranger had located children hidden beneath collapsed wooden docks long after electronic equipment failed. During wildfire evacuations, he had led firefighters toward an elderly couple trapped behind smoke too dense for helicopters to see. Statistics had been wrong before. Faith sometimes ignored statistics. A gentle breeze drifted across the ruined neighborhood, carrying the faint scent of wet earth and flowering trees from a nearby hillside untouched by destruction. The contrast felt almost impossible. Nature continued breathing while an entire community waited, between grief and hope. Then, just as another convoy prepared to leave, Ranger's ears lifted sharply. He inhaled once, stepped backward exactly 2 feet, circled in a slow half-turn, and returned to the same crack with even greater determination. Daniel watched every movement. The pattern was different this time. Ranger was no longer searching. He was confirming. Daniel slowly lowered himself beside the dog once again, placing one hand against the cool concrete. At first he heard nothing except his own breathing. Then, somewhere impossibly deep beneath layers of broken stone, there came the faintest sound imaginable. Not a voice, not a cry, just 3 soft taps that almost disappeared before they reached the surface. Daniel closed his eyes and held his breath, afraid that even the sound of his own heartbeat might drown out what he had just heard. 3 faint taps. They were so weak that anyone standing a few feet away would have missed them completely, but Ranger had not missed them. The German shepherd answered with 3 calm barks, each one measured, each one separated by a heartbeat, as though carrying on a conversation through layers of shattered concrete. Every hair along Daniel's arms stood upright. He had seen this before in search operations where frightened survivors lacked the strength to shout, but still found a way to answer. He looked toward the command trailer and shouted, "Everybody hold your positions. I need complete silence." The activity across the rescue site stopped almost instantly. Engines were switched off. Radios were lowered. Even the families standing behind the barriers seemed to understand that something extraordinary might be happening. The city, which had echoed with machinery only moments before, became almost completely still. Daniel pressed his ear against the fractured slab once again. Nothing. Only silence. A rescue supervisor slowly approached and rested a gentle hand on Daniel's shoulder. "Are you certain?" he asked quietly. Daniel did not answer immediately. He looked at Ranger instead. The dog remained perfectly focused, his amber eyes locked on the narrow opening, his breathing slow and steady. Then Ranger scratched the concrete exactly 3 times before lowering his head again. Daniel smiled softly. He is asking for another answer. Everyone watched without speaking. Several endless seconds passed before another sound floated upward through the rubble. Top, top, top. Slightly slower this time, but unmistakably real. A young volunteer gasped and covered her mouth with both hands. One of the engineers immediately dropped to his knees beside Daniel, listening carefully. His eyes widened. "I hear it," he whispered. "There is definitely someone down there." Hope spread across the rescue site faster than any command ever could. Radios crackled back to life, but this time they carried excitement instead of resignation. Medical teams reopened emergency kits they had already packed away. Search specialists hurried back, carrying fiber optic cameras, listening devices, and compact drilling equipment designed for delicate rescues. Emily closed her eyes for one brief moment, silently thanking God before rushing to coordinate supplies. Behind the safety barriers, Klieber's mother looked toward the activity with trembling hands. She had refused to leave the site since the earthquake, surviving on little sleep and endless prayers. She could not hear the tiny tapping beneath the concrete, but she saw the expressions on the rescuers' faces changing. For the first time in 6 long days, someone smiled at her instead of looking away. Tears filled her eyes before anyone spoke a single word. Deep beneath the rubble, Klieber leaned weakly against the narrow wall surrounding him. His fingertips hurt from tapping the broken pipe beside him, but when he stopped, he thought he heard something impossible. 3 distant barks echoed through the darkness. Soft, muffled, almost like a dream. His tired eyes opened wider. "Doggy," he whispered into the darkness with a voice barely stronger than a breath. He lifted his hand again and tapped 3 more times with all the strength he could gather. Every movement exhausted him, yet hope flowed through his small body like fresh air. He was no longer alone. Above him, Ranger's tail moved for the first time all morning. Not wildly, just one slow sweep across the dusty ground. Daniel recognized that signal immediately. The dog was no longer searching for a survivor. He had found one. Now he was waiting for the humans to catch up. The senior engineer unfolded new structural maps across the hood of a rescue truck. "If the sound is traveling from this direction," he explained, tracing careful lines with his finger, "there may be a narrow air pocket beneath the central support beam. We cannot use heavy machinery anymore. Every inch will have to be cleared by hand." Several rescuers exchanged worried glances. It would take hours, perhaps longer. Clouds drifted overhead, dimming the morning sun while a gentle breeze carried another scent of approaching rain through the broken streets. Daniel looked toward the darkening sky, then back at Ranger. Time had already stolen 6 precious days. Now another storm threatened to steal the little time they had left. Hope can make even the strongest hands tremble because now every decision mattered. The rescue commander gathered the team around the fractured foundation and spoke with calm determination. From this moment forward, no heavy equipment. Every piece comes out by hand. We protect the void at all costs. Dozens of volunteers immediately exchanged steel tools for brushes, pry bars, lifting cushions, and compact rescue jacks. Dust floated through the humid morning air as the operation transformed from a race against time into a test of patience. Daniel knelt beside Ranger one last time before joining the line of rescuers. He rested his forehead gently against the German shepherd's for only a second. "Stay with him," he whispered. Ranger answered with a quiet whine, then settled beside the narrow opening without taking his eyes from the hidden space beneath the concrete. Several engineers carefully inserted a small fiber optic camera through a crack no wider than 2 inches. The flexible cable disappeared into darkness while everyone crowded around the tiny monitor. Static flickered across the screen. Broken pipes, twisted metal, fragments of furniture. Then the signal vanished completely. One technician slowly pulled the camera back out and shook his head. The passage collapses after about 12 feet. We cannot see beyond it. A wave of disappointment swept across the group, but Daniel refused to let it settle. "If there is an air pocket," he said, "there is another way in." The senior engineer studied the structural drawings once more before pointing toward the remains of what had once been a small apartment kitchen. "There may be a narrow vertical channel here. It will take longer, but avoids placing pressure on the trapped space." Nobody complained about the extra work. Every volunteer immediately moved into position. They lifted loose stones one by one, passing each piece carefully from one set of hands to another like a silent chain joined by purpose alone. Behind the barriers, Klieber's mother watched every movement with folded hands pressed tightly against her lips. Emily walked over carrying a bottle of water and offered it gently. The exhausted woman accepted it with grateful eyes. "Do you really believe they found my son?" she asked through trembling breaths. Emily smiled softly before answering. "I have seen Ranger refuse to give up before. He has never stayed this certain unless someone was waiting." The mother's eyes filled with tears once again, but this time they carried something different. They carried hope that had almost disappeared forever. Beneath the ruins, Klieber listened as faint scraping sounds echoed through the darkness. At first he wondered if he was dreaming again, but then tiny grains of dust drifted from above, catching against his hair and shoulders. He reached toward the sound, even though nothing could be seen. "I am here," he whispered with all the strength he could gather. His voice barely traveled beyond the small chamber surrounding him. Yet speaking those words reminded him that he still belonged to the world above. He closed his eyes and remembered the neighborhood dog that used to greet him every afternoon after school. The distant barking he had heard earlier no longer felt like imagination. Somewhere beyond the stone, a dog was still calling to him. Above ground, clouds continued gathering across the mountains, casting long shadows over the damaged city. A weather officer approached the command post carrying an updated forecast. Heavy rain could arrive within 2 hours, he warned. If it starts, water could enter unstable sections of the collapse zone. Several rescuers exchanged worried glances. Rain would slow everything. Worse still, it could weaken already fractured concrete. Daniel looked toward the darkening sky, then back toward Ranger. The German shepherd suddenly stood, lifted his nose into the wind, and released one deep bark before returning to the opening. Daniel understood immediately. Ranger was not reacting to the weather. He was reminding them that someone below was still waiting. The team worked faster, but never carelessly, removing another layer of debris inch by inch until a young volunteer suddenly held up his hand. Everyone froze. From somewhere beneath the newly opened gap came a faint current of cool air brushing gently across their faces. The hidden chamber was closer than anyone had dared to believe. The gentle current of cool air changed everything. It was not strong enough for anyone outside the rescue circle to notice. But to the engineers, it meant one extraordinary thing. Somewhere beneath the collapsed building, an open space was still breathing. The senior engineer slowly removed his gloves and closed his eyes for a brief moment before looking at Daniel. "The air pocket is real," he said quietly. "If it has remained stable this long, then the child may still have enough oxygen." No one cheered. Hope had become too precious to waste on celebration. Instead, every rescuer returned to work with even greater care. Small brushes swept away loose dust while thin wooden supports were carefully placed beneath cracked concrete to prevent sudden movement. Every inch they gained felt like a victory earned through patience instead of force. Ranger remained beside the opening without moving more than a few inches. His ears shifted constantly, catching sounds no microphone could fully capture. Every few minutes, he lowered his nose toward the crack and released a soft whine, almost as though he wanted the frightened child below to know that someone had not forgotten him. Daniel watched the dog with quiet admiration. During years of working together, he had learned that Ranger possessed a remarkable gift. The German Shepherd did not simply search for survivors. He stayed with them emotionally, refusing to abandon them even when he could not physically reach them. That loyalty had saved more lives than Daniel could count. Deep beneath the broken foundation, Klieber noticed something new. The air no longer felt as heavy as before. A cool breeze brushed softly across his dusty face, carrying with it the faint scent of rain and fresh earth. It was the first smell from the outside world he had sensed since the earthquake. His tired eyes slowly filled with tears. He reached one small hand toward the narrow crack above him, even though he knew nobody could see it. "Please keep coming," he whispered. His voice was barely louder than his breathing, but speaking the words made him feel less alone. He remembered his mother telling him that brave people never stopped believing, even when they could not see the answer yet. Those words returned now, like a warm blanket around his frightened heart. Above the rubble, Emily organized fresh medical supplies beside Dr. Sarah Mitchell, who reviewed emergency treatment plans in case the child was reached alive. Blankets were unfolded. Warm fluids were prepared. A small stuffed bear, donated by another volunteer, was quietly placed beside the medical kit. No one knew if the trapped child would be frightened, but everyone wanted the first thing he saw after the darkness to remind him that kindness had been waiting for him all along. Clouds continued gathering across the mountains, turning the bright morning into a dim gray afternoon. Thunder rumbled somewhere far beyond the city, gentle but impossible to ignore. The weather officer checked the radar again before approaching the command team. "The rain is moving faster than expected," he reported. "We probably have less than 90 minutes before it reaches us." The words settled heavily across the rescue site. Water flowing through unstable debris could erase the fragile passage they had worked so carefully to uncover. Daniel looked toward the sky only once before returning his attention to Ranger. The dog suddenly stood, walked several feet to the left, sniffed a fractured support column, then returned to the original opening. He barked only once. Daniel studied the movement carefully. "He is telling us the chamber extends farther in this direction," he said. The senior engineer compared Ranger's position with the structural drawings. His eyes widened. "He is right," he whispered. "There was a hallway here before the collapse. If the ceiling folded instead of falling completely, it could have created a protected pocket exactly where the airflow is strongest." The rescue team immediately adjusted their approach, carefully redirecting their efforts toward the newly identified section. Every movement became slower, more deliberate, almost reverent. Then, as another layer of broken concrete was gently lifted away, a volunteer shining a flashlight into the narrow opening suddenly stopped breathing for a second. Far below, almost hidden beneath dust and darkness, something reflected the beam. It was not metal. It was not glass. It was the tiny blue paint of a little toy truck resting beside a very small hand. The flashlight remained perfectly still as every rescuer leaned closer to the narrow opening. For several long seconds, no one dared to speak. Resting beside a small dust-covered hand was a bright blue toy truck, its worn paint reflecting the thin beam of light like a tiny star hidden beneath a mountain of broken stone. The volunteer slowly looked back at Daniel, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I can see him." The words spread through the rescue site with quiet disbelief. Klieber's mother covered her face as tears rolled freely down her cheeks. Emily gently wrapped an arm around her shoulders, both women standing in silence as hope became something they could finally touch. Daniel lowered himself beside the opening and called carefully into the darkness. "Klieber, my name is Daniel. You are not alone anymore. Can you hear me?" At first there was only silence. Then, after several endless heartbeats, a tiny voice floated upward through the narrow passage. Weak, hoarse, but unmistakably alive. "Yes." Several volunteers, quietly, wiped tears from their faces before returning immediately to work. There was still a long way to go before the little boy could be brought home. Dr. Sarah Mitchell knelt beside the opening and spoke with calm reassurance. "Klieber, we're going to come to you very slowly. We need you to stay as still as you can. Can you do that for us?" A brief pause followed before the little voice answered again. "I can try." Ranger's ears lifted at the sound. His tail swept gently across the dusty ground as he lay down beside the opening, lowering his head until his nose almost touched the narrow crack. A soft whine escaped his throat. Deep below, Klieber heard it clearly this time. A smile slowly appeared across his tired face despite everything he had endured. "Doggy," he whispered, "you came back." Daniel looked at Ranger with quiet emotion. The German shepherd answered the child's voice with another gentle bark, careful and reassuring, as though promising that he would remain there until the very end. Even the experienced rescuers exchanged amazed glances. One firefighter quietly said, "He knows exactly who he has been talking to." The operation continued inch by inch. Engineers inserted additional supports beneath fractured concrete, while volunteers passed away loose debris by hand. Every movement required complete concentration because the protective air pocket surrounding Klieber remained delicate. The slightest mistake could close the narrow passage they had fought so hard to uncover. Time seemed to slow. Every minute felt like an hour. Above them, the sky grew darker. A distant flash of lightning illuminated the surrounding mountains, followed several seconds later by a low rumble of thunder. The weather officer looked toward the approaching storm with growing concern. "Rain is less than 40 minutes away," he warned. "If water reaches this section before extraction is complete, conditions will become much more difficult." The rescue commander nodded silently. Nobody needed to be reminded what that meant. Every pair of hands began moving with greater purpose while preserving the same careful precision. Down below, Klieber rested one hand on the little blue truck that had remained beside him throughout the long days of darkness. It reminded him of happier mornings riding beside his mother through the streets of their neighborhood, waving at neighbors who always smiled back. He closed his eyes and listened again. He could hear, scraping above him, gentle voices, the comforting bark of the dog. For the first time since the earthquake, he no longer imagined what rescue might sound like. He was hearing it. Daniel leaned closer once more. "Klieber, what is your favorite thing to do?" There was another tired pause before the little boy answered. "Play outside with Mama." Daniel smiled warmly. "When you come out of there, I think someone very special wants to meet you." Ranger lifted his head immediately, almost as if he understood every word. Klieber gave the faintest laugh, soft enough to disappear into the darkness, but strong enough to make everyone above stop for a moment and smile. It was the first sound of joy anyone had heard at that rescue site in 6 long days. Then, without warning, the ground beneath their feet gave a tiny shudder. It lasted only a second, but small pebbles rolled gently across the broken concrete as every engineer instantly looked toward the unstable structure above them. The gentle tremor lasted no more than a heartbeat, yet it was enough to stop every pair of hands. Dust drifted silently from the fractured ceiling above the rescue tunnel, sparkling through the gray afternoon light before settling across helmets, gloves, and the weathered back of Ranger's coat. No one moved. No one spoke. Every rescuer waited for another vibration that never came. The senior engineer slowly exhaled and looked around the site with measured caution. "The structure is still holding," he said quietly, "but we are running out of time." His words carried no panic, only truth. Dark clouds had now covered nearly the entire sky above Merida, turning the afternoon into something that felt closer to evening. A cool breeze swept through the broken streets, carrying the unmistakable scent of approaching rain. Daniel glanced toward the horizon before kneeling beside the narrow opening once again. "Klieber," he called gently, "you may hear some strange sounds while we work, but I need you to remember something." The little boy answered after a short pause. "What?" Daniel smiled softly, even though the child could not see him. "Every sound you hear means we're getting closer." A faint giggle floated back through the darkness, followed by a tired whisper. "I am waiting." Those three simple words settled deeply into every heart nearby. Ranger lowered himself completely onto the dusty ground, stretching one paw toward the narrow crack, as though trying to shorten the distance between himself and the frightened child. His amber eyes never left the opening. Every few moments his ears twitched toward the faint sound below, then back toward the workers above, quietly measuring both worlds at once. Emily watched him with quiet admiration. "He has not rested since he found the signal," she whispered. Daniel gently rubbed the German shepherd's shoulder. "He will rest when the boy is safe." The rescue commander reviewed the latest structural readings displayed on a portable monitor. Thin colored lines represented pressure changes inside the collapsed building. One section continued shifting slowly under the weight of fractured concrete. "We need another access point," one engineer suggested. Another carefully shook his head. Digging from a different angle could destabilize the air pocket. Silence followed. Every option carried risk. Then Ranger suddenly stood. Without barking, he walked several yards along the broken foundation, stopped beside what had once been an exterior wall, sniffed carefully, and looked back toward Daniel. He repeated the movement twice before sitting quietly beside the new location. Daniel immediately understood that the dog was trying to communicate something. He carried the old building plans over to the engineer and compared them with Ranger's position. The engineer traced one faded hallway with his finger before looking up in surprise. "This used to be a children's bedroom," he said softly. The ventilation shaft passed directly behind this wall. Daniel looked from the drawing to Ranger. "Can we reach it?" The engineer nodded slowly. "If the shaft remained partially intact, it could allow us to send fresh air and water without disturbing the chamber." Within moments, volunteers carefully cleared loose debris around the new location. Every movement remained deliberate, every stone lifted by hand instead of force. After nearly 20 careful minutes, one rescuer uncovered the edge of a narrow metal ventilation pipe, bent but not completely crushed. Dr. Sarah Mitchell immediately connected a flexible medical tube to the opening. "Klieber," she called warmly, "we're sending you a little fresh air." A few seconds later, the faint sound of the child breathing reached the surface. "It feels cooler," he whispered. Tears filled Sarah's eyes as she smiled toward Daniel. "That means the passage is open." They slowly lowered a small bottle attached to a thin rescue cord. It disappeared into the darkness until the line suddenly became lighter. Everyone waited. Then the tiny bottle returned empty. A quiet wave of relief spread across the rescue team. The child had received water. Deep below, Klieber held the little bottle against his chest for a moment before carefully placing it beside his blue toy truck. Hope no longer felt like a dream. It had become something he could hold in his own hands. Above him, the first cool raindrop landed softly on Daniel's sleeve. Then another touched Ranger's nose. Within seconds, a gentle rain began falling across the shattered city, and every rescuer looked upward knowing that the next chapter of the mission had just become even more difficult. Rain settled over the ruined neighborhood like a heavy gray curtain, soaking broken rooftops, cracked streets, and the rescue workers who refused to step away. Water trickled through shattered concrete in thin streams, disappearing into gaps no one could fully see. Every rescuer understood the danger. Too much water could weaken the fragile pocket protecting Klieber. Too much movement could erase the narrow path they had spent hours uncovering. The commander quietly ordered waterproof covers stretched above the rescue opening, while volunteers anchored them with ropes and sandbags. The makeshift shelter shook gently in the rising wind, but it gave the team precious protection to continue working. Daniel wiped rainwater from his face before kneeling beside the ventilation tube. "Klieber," he called gently, "the rain has started, but we are still here." For several long seconds, there was no answer. Daniel waited patiently. "Can you hear me, buddy?" Silence answered once again. The rescue site slowly grew still. Dr. Sarah Mitchell leaned closer to the tube. "Klieber, nothing." The little voice that had encouraged everyone only minutes earlier had disappeared completely. Klieber's mother noticed the expressions changing and instinctively stepped forward before Emily gently caught her hand. Neither woman spoke. They simply watched the faces of the rescuers searching for hope in one another's eyes. Deep below the rubble, Klieber had wrapped his arms around the little blue truck and rested his head against the cool concrete wall. The effort of speaking, waiting, and staying awake had slowly drained the last of his strength. The fresh air reaching him through the narrow tube comforted him enough that his exhausted body slipped into a deep sleep. He no longer heard the scraping above him or the distant rain filtering through broken stone. Everything became quiet again. Above, the silence felt much more frightening because nobody knew why it had come. One engineer carefully checked the airflow. "The passage is still open," he reported. Another technician confirmed the oxygen level remained stable. Nothing suggested the protected chamber had collapsed, yet no answer came from below. Daniel lowered his head for a brief moment. He remembered another rescue years earlier after a hurricane, when fear had almost convinced everyone to leave a collapsed house behind. Ranger had refused to move then as well, and 3 hours later an elderly woman had been found sleeping beneath a fallen staircase, exhausted but alive. Daniel slowly looked toward the German Shepherd. Ranger was not barking. He was not pacing. He simply remained stretched beside the opening with complete calm, breathing steadily while keeping one ear turned toward the darkness below. There was no panic in his eyes, no uncertainty, only quiet confidence. Daniel smiled softly. "He is sleeping," he whispered. Several rescuers looked at him with surprise. "How can you know?" one volunteer asked. Daniel rested a hand gently across Ranger's back. "Because if something had changed, Ranger would already be telling us." The words settled across the team like a small light in the middle of the storm. They trusted the dog because he had earned that trust one mission at a time. Work continued carefully despite the rain. Volunteers removed another layer of broken concrete, while engineers reinforced weakened sections with additional supports. Every few minutes Daniel called softly through the tube, not expecting an answer, only wanting the child to hear a familiar voice if he awakened. "We are still here. You're doing great. Keep resting." Those simple words drifted into the darkness like quiet promises. Nearly half an hour passed before Ranger suddenly lifted his head. His ears turned sharply toward the opening. His tail gave one slow sweep across the wet ground. Daniel immediately leaned closer to the tube. A tiny cough echoed faintly through the passage. Then came the smallest voice imaginable. "I had a dream." Relief spread across the rescue site so quickly that several volunteers laughed through tears. Daniel closed his eyes for one grateful second before answering warmly. "Was it a good dream?" A sleepy little voice floated back through the darkness. "The dog was waiting for me." Ranger answered with one gentle bark that echoed softly beneath the broken building. Klieber laughed again, a little stronger this time. But at that exact moment, one of the structural monitors began emitting a quiet warning tone as a thin crack slowly appeared across the concrete beam directly above the rescue tunnel. The quiet warning tone echoed through the rain like a heartbeat everyone wished they could ignore. Every engineer turned toward the portable monitor where thin red lines slowly crept across the screen, tracing the pressure building inside the damaged support beam above the rescue tunnel. The senior engineer looked up immediately. "We have movement," he said calmly. "Not a collapse, but the beam is carrying more weight than before." Daniel followed his gaze to the narrow crack stretching across the concrete overhead. It was barely visible, no wider than the edge of a coin, yet every experienced rescuer understood what it meant. The storm was changing the building. Water was finding its way into hidden fractures, quietly testing every weakened surface. Nobody panicked. Instead, the entire team moved with even greater precision. Additional steel braces were carried into position, while hydraulic stabilization posts were carefully extended beneath the damaged section. Every adjustment was measured twice before a single tool touched the structure. Ranger watched each movement without leaving his place beside the opening. Rain collected along his sable coat, but he never shook it away. His eyes remained fixed on the darkness below, listening to sounds that no instrument could fully capture. Daniel knelt beside him once again and spoke softly into the ventilation tube. "Klieber, we need you to help us just a little longer." The little boy answered with a sleepy but steady voice. "I'm still here." Daniel smiled. "Can you tell me what you were holding?" There was a short pause before the child replied. "My blue truck." Several volunteers exchanged emotional smiles because they remembered seeing its tiny reflection beneath the flashlight beam. "Keep holding on to it," Daniel said warmly. "When you come out, you can show it to Ranger." A faint laugh drifted upward. "Does he like trucks?" Daniel looked at the German shepherd before answering. "He likes brave kids." Ranger responded with one soft bark that echoed gently through the narrow passage. Deep below the rubble, Klieber rested his hand against the warm airflow from the rescue tube. The voices above no longer sounded distant. They felt close enough to touch. He imagined Daniel sitting beside the dog exactly as he had pictured them in his dream. That image became stronger than the darkness surrounding him. He whispered quietly, "I'm not scared anymore." Above ground, Dr. Sarah Mitchell prepared another small supply package. This time it contained warm electrolyte solution, a tiny flashlight, and a handwritten note sealed inside a "What's a poof bake?" Before lowering it through the tube, she smiled and said, "There is something special inside for you." Several minutes later, Klieber carefully opened the small package with tired fingers. The flashlight filled the tiny chamber with a gentle glow for the first time in 6 days. The light was not bright, but it was enough for him to see the blue truck beside him and the rough concrete walls that had become his unexpected shelter. Then he unfolded the small note. Although his hands trembled, he slowly read each word aloud. "You are never alone. We are coming. Keep believing." He pressed the note carefully against his chest before placing it beside his truck. Above the rubble, the rescue tunnel had finally reached the last major barrier separating the team from the protected chamber. One massive concrete slab rested at an awkward angle, supported only by fractured walls and temporary braces. The senior engineer studied it for several moments before speaking. "If we lift this too quickly, we risk shifting the entire pocket. If we leave it where it is, we lose precious time." Silence settled over the group. Every option carried uncertainty. Daniel looked down at Ranger, who suddenly stood, walked toward the edge of the slab, and gently touched it once with his nose before stepping back and sitting quietly. The engineer noticed the exact location and compared it with the structural drawings one final time. His expression slowly changed. "Not upward," he whispered. "Sideways." He quickly explained that the slab had originally rested against a reinforced hallway wall. Sliding it laterally only a few inches would release the pressure without forcing weight downward. The rescue commander nodded immediately. Heavy lifting straps were positioned with extraordinary care while every volunteer took their place. Rain continued falling steadily overhead as Daniel looked toward the opening and spoke one more reassuring sentence into the tube. "Klieber, when I count to 3, you may hear a loud scraping sound. That means we are almost there." The little boy answered without hesitation. "I will be waiting." Every rescuer tightened their grip. The commander slowly raised one hand into the rain. 1, 2, 3, and the great slab began to move. The great slab shifted only an inch at first, releasing a deep grinding sound that rolled through the broken building like distant thunder. Every rescuer froze exactly where they stood, waiting for the structure to settle. The stabilization monitors remained steady. The reinforced supports held their position. The senior engineer slowly nodded. Again, he whispered. With patient precision, the team continued guiding the massive piece of concrete sideways another few inches until a narrow opening appeared beneath it. A cool rush of fresh air escaped from the hidden chamber, carrying the unmistakable scent of damp concrete mixed with the warmth of human breath. Daniel immediately dropped to one knee beside the opening and aimed a flashlight through the newly created passage. This time the beam traveled much farther than before. Dust floated gently through the narrow space before settling upon a tiny blue truck resting beside a small boy wrapped inside the protective pocket the collapsed hallway had unknowingly created. Klieber blinked against the sudden light. He lifted one tired hand to shield his eyes before slowly smiling. "You found me," he whispered. Daniel felt his throat tighten. "We promised we would." Ranger stood beside him, ears raised high, his tail sweeping softly through the rain-soaked dust. The moment Klieber heard the familiar movement above him, he turned his head toward the sound. "Is that my doggy?" Daniel laughed quietly. "He has been waiting for you this whole time." Ranger answered with one gentle bark that echoed into the chamber. Klieber smiled even wider. "I knew he would stay." Dr. Sarah Mitchell carefully examined the opening before speaking to the engineers. "The space is large enough for one rescuer to reach him, but we cannot risk disturbing the remaining supports." Daniel looked toward the commander. No words were necessary. The commander simply nodded once. "Go." Daniel removed his rescue pack, secured a lightweight safety harness around his waist, and slowly eased himself into the narrow passage. Every movement was deliberate. Every hand above guided the safety line with careful precision. Rain continued falling outside, but beneath the rubble there was only silence and the soft sound of Daniel breathing as he crawled closer to the child. The flashlight illuminated Klieber's face more clearly now. His clothes were covered with dust, his cheeks were pale, and his hair was streaked with dried concrete powder. Yet his eyes remained bright with remarkable courage. The little blue truck rested securely against his chest exactly where he had protected it for 6 long days. Daniel smiled warmly as he reached the small chamber. "Hello, partner." Klieber looked up at him with quiet wonder. "You are real." Daniel gently placed one hand over the child's shoulder. "Very real." Klieber looked beyond him toward the faint opening above. "And the dog?" Daniel turned slightly so Ranger could see through the gap. The German shepherd immediately lowered his head, his amber eyes meeting the little boy's for the first time. Neither moved. For one beautiful moment, the ruined world outside disappeared. It was only a child and a loyal dog recognizing one another without ever having truly met before. Klieber slowly stretched out one dusty hand toward the opening. Ranger answered by extending one front paw as far as he could. Their fingertips and paw never quite touched, but the distance between them no longer mattered. He waited, Klieber whispered. Daniel nodded softly. Every minute, tears quietly filled the eyes of volunteers watching from above. Even the seasoned firefighters lowered their heads for a moment, touched by the simple grace unfolding before them. Dr. Sarah prepared a lightweight rescue blanket, while Emily organized the medical team outside the tunnel entrance. The commander checked the weather once more. Rain continued steadily, but the structure remained stable enough for extraction. Daniel carefully secured the child's safety harness around his small frame, making certain every buckle rested comfortably. "We're going to take a slow ride together," he said gently. Klieber looked down at the blue truck still resting in his lap. "Can it come too?" Daniel smiled. "Absolutely. Heroes never leave. They're partners behind." Klieber hugged the little toy tightly with one hand, while Daniel wrapped the other arm securely around him. Above them, Ranger stood the moment the safety line became taut, watching every movement with complete attention. The rescue team slowly began lifting them toward the light, inch by careful inch, as the first rays of evening sunlight finally broke through the storm clouds and spilled across the opening, waiting to welcome a little boy back into the world. When Daniel emerged from the narrow passage carrying Klieber safely against his chest, the entire rescue site seemed to stop breathing for one unforgettable moment. Rain still fell softly across the broken city, but no one noticed it anymore. Every pair of eyes followed the little boy rising slowly into the fading evening light. The rescue team guided the safety lines with steady hands until Daniel finally stepped on solid ground. Dr. Sarah Mitchell and the medical crew approached immediately. Yet they paused for just 1 second as Klieber slowly opened his eyes beneath the gray sky. He looked around at the faces surrounding him, then searched through the crowd for only one familiar shape. Ranger was already there. The German shepherd walked forward quietly, his paws leaving wet prints across the dusty concrete. He stopped only inches away and gently lowered his head. Klieber reached out with a trembling hand, still clutching the little blue truck in the other. His fingers disappeared into the thick sable fur around Ranger's neck, and the loyal dog leaned closer without making a sound. For several long seconds, neither moved. There was no cheering, no applause, only quiet tears and grateful smiles as everyone witnessed a reunion built not on words, but on trust. Klieber rested his forehead against Ranger's and whispered, "You really stayed." Ranger answered by softly licking the boy's dusty hand before settling beside him as though he had always belonged there. Daniel quietly stepped back, allowing the moment to belong entirely to them. Klieber's mother hurried forward the instant Dr. Sarah gave a reassuring nod. She knelt beside her son, wrapping him in the gentlest embrace, while careful not to disturb the medical blanket around his shoulders. Tears streamed freely down her face as she whispered over and over, "You are home. You are home." Klieber smiled weakly and looked up at her with tired but peaceful eyes. "The dog kept talking to me," he said softly. His mother looked toward Ranger, then toward Daniel, unable to find words large enough to express what filled her heart. She simply reached out and squeezed Daniel's hand before placing her other hand gently on Ranger's head. Around them, volunteers quietly wiped away tears while reporters lowered their cameras, realizing that some moments deserved respect before headlines. Dr. Sarah completed her examination with calm confidence. "His pulse is steady," she said with a relieved smile. "He is dehydrated and exhausted, but he is responding beautifully." The word spread across the rescue site like the first warm sunlight after a storm. Emily quietly thanked every volunteer who had refused to leave despite the rain, while the rescue commander removed his helmet and looked toward Daniel. "Your partner saved this mission," he said sincerely. Daniel glanced at Ranger, who had not taken his eyes off Klieber for even a second. "He saved all of us," Daniel answered. The commander smiled, knowingly, because he understood exactly what Daniel meant. Sometimes one act of unwavering loyalty reminded an entire community why hope should never be abandoned. As the ambulance prepared to leave, Klieber looked anxiously toward Ranger again. "Can he come?" he asked. Dr. Sarah laughed gently. "I think we can make room for one very important visitor." Ranger calmly jumped into the ambulance and settled beside the stretcher, resting his head near Klieber's small hand. The little boy immediately relaxed, his breathing slowing as he gently stroked the dog's fur. Outside, evening sunlight finally broke through the last remaining clouds, casting golden light across the shattered neighborhood. Broken buildings still stood where they had fallen. Streets remained covered with rubble. The city still carried deep wounds that would take years to heal. Yet in the middle of that broken landscape, something invisible had already begun to grow again. It was not built from concrete or steel. It was built from courage, compassion, and the quiet faith of one loyal German shepherd who refused to believe that a child beneath the darkness had been forgotten. The following morning, sunlight returned to the mountains surrounding the city with a quiet gentleness that felt different from the days before. The broken buildings still stood as reminders of everything that had been lost, but birds had begun singing again from the trees, untouched by the earthquake, and neighbors who had spent days searching through dust now greeted one another with small but genuine smiles. Inside the children's ward of the local hospital, warm morning light drifted through an open window, carrying the scent of fresh rain and flowering trees. Klieber sat upright against a stack of pillows, wrapped in a soft blue blanket, while carefully rolling his little toy truck across the bed. The movements were slow, but every small laugh sounded stronger than the one before. Dr. Sarah Mitchell finished another examination before smiling warmly. "You are getting stronger every hour," she said. Klieber looked toward the doorway almost immediately. "Is Ranger here?" Before anyone answered, familiar footsteps echoed gently down the hallway, followed by the soft clicking of 4 paws across polished floors. Ranger appeared beside Daniel, his sable coat freshly brushed but still carrying a few tiny patches of dust that no one had wanted to remove completely. They had become quiet reminders of the place where hope refused to disappear. The German shepherd walked directly to the bedside, rested his head beside Klieber's arm, and closed his eyes with complete contentment. The little boy laughed softly and wrapped both arms around the loyal dog. "I knew you would come back," he whispered. Daniel smiled from the doorway, without interrupting the moment. Emily stood beside him holding a small paper bag. Inside was a brand new red toy truck donated by one of the volunteers who had watched the rescue unfold. She handed it to Klieber with a gentle smile. "Your blue truck carried you through the hardest days," she said. "Maybe this one can remind you of the brighter days ahead." Klieber looked from a new truck to the old one resting beside him before carefully placing them next to each other. "They can be friends," he said with the simple wisdom only a child could offer. Everyone in the room smiled. Later that afternoon, several members of the rescue team quietly visited the hospital. None of them came seeking recognition. They came because they had become part of one another's lives during those unforgettable days beneath the rubble. The senior engineer brought Klieber a framed photograph of the rescue team standing together after the operation. In the center of the picture sat Ranger, calm, as always, looking directly toward the camera while everyone else smiled around him. "You gave all of us something to remember," the engineer said softly. Daniel gently shook his head. "He did," he replied, resting a hand on Ranger's shoulder. The room felt comfortably quiet. No one argued because everyone knew it was true. News crews continued requesting interviews throughout the day, hoping to tell the remarkable story that had captured hearts across the country. When one reporter finally asked Daniel what had made him ignore every statistic telling him the search was over, he looked toward Ranger before answering. "Experience teaches you to trust evidence," he said calmly. "But sometimes evidence begins with loyalty." Ranger never stopped believing someone was waiting, so neither did I. Those words quietly spread far beyond the hospital walls, inspiring thousands of people who had followed the rescue from the very beginning. That evening, as the sun slowly disappeared behind the Venezuelan mountains, Daniel wheeled Klieber outside into the hospital garden. Flowers glowed softly beneath the golden light, while a gentle breeze rustled through the trees. Ranger walked quietly beside the wheelchair until Klieber reached down and rested one small hand against the dog's neck. Neither of them needed to speak. They simply watched the sunset together, breathing the cool evening air that had once seemed impossible to feel again. In that peaceful silence, Daniel realized something that no medal, newspaper headline, or public recognition could ever equal. Sometimes the greatest miracles are not measured by the lives that are rescued alone. They are measured by the hearts that choose never to give up on one another, even when the whole world quietly believes it is already too late. Several months later, the streets of Merida no longer echoed with rescue sirens. The piles of broken concrete had slowly disappeared, replaced by workers rebuilding homes, planting young trees, and repainting schools where laughter had finally returned. Life had not erased the memory of the earthquake, but had gently taught the city how to carry it with courage instead of fear. On a clear Saturday morning, the rebuilt neighborhood gathered for a small community celebration in the park overlooking the mountains. Children chased soccer balls across fresh green grass, while families shared homemade food beneath colorful tents. Music drifted softly through the warm breeze, blending with birdsong and the joyful sounds of a town discovering hope again. Near the center of the park stood a newly planted cedar tree. At its base rested a simple bronze plaque. It did not list heroic titles or dramatic achievements. It carried only a quiet message that everyone who had lived through those 6 unforgettable days understood. It read, "Hope often arrives on 4 faithful paws." Daniel stood a short distance away beside Emily, watching children run freely through the sunlight. Ranger sat calmly at his side, older now by only a few months, but carrying the same steady gaze that had never abandoned a single promise. The German shepherd did not seem interested in the attention from visitors who recognized him from the news. Instead, his eyes searched only one direction. Across the park, Klieber came running with both of his toy trucks tucked carefully beneath one arm. His steps were stronger now, filled with the confidence that had slowly returned through weeks of healing. The moment he spotted Ranger, his face lit up with the same smile that had first appeared beneath the evening sky outside the rescue tunnel. He slowed only enough to kneel beside the loyal dog before wrapping both arms around his neck. Ranger leaned gently into the embrace and rested his head against the little boy's shoulder exactly as he had done in the hospital. Neither seemed surprised to see the other. Some friendships never need introductions because they begin long before 2 hearts finally meet. Klieber carefully placed the old blue truck and the newer red truck beneath the cedar tree for a moment. "They're taking a little break," he whispered with a smile. Daniel walked over and sat beside him on the grass. "Do you still remember the dream you told us about?" he asked softly. Klieber nodded. "I thought the dog was waiting for me." He gently stroked Ranger's ears before adding, "But it was not a dream after all." Daniel looked toward the mountains glowing beneath the afternoon sun. "No," he answered quietly. "Sometimes the best things are already waiting for us. We just cannot see them yet." As the celebration continued, children gathered around Ranger, laughing as he patiently accepted every gentle hug and every small hand reaching to pet his soft fur. He never sought the center of attention. He simply stayed close to Klieber, quietly watching the little boy race across the grass with growing strength. Emily smiled as she watched them disappear among the other children. "He gave that family their future back," she whispered. Daniel shook his head gently. "They gave us ours too." Evening slowly settled across the valley, painting the sky with warm shades of gold, orange, and soft blue. Families began folding chairs and saying their goodbyes while the first stars quietly appeared above the mountains. Klieber walked back to the cedar tree one last time before leaving. He picked up both toy trucks, looked down at the bronze plaque, and placed one small hand against it for just a moment. Then he turned toward Ranger. "Ready to go home?" The German shepherd stood immediately, his tail moving with quiet happiness as they walked together toward the waiting families. Daniel watched them until they disappeared beyond the trees, then lifted his eyes toward the peaceful evening sky. Some people spend their whole lives searching for proof that miracles still exist. Yet miracles rarely arrive with bright lights or loud voices. Sometimes they arrive disguised as quiet determination, patient hands, a frightened child's courage, and the unwavering heart of a loyal German shepherd who simply refuses to walk away. And perhaps that is how grace has always found its way into the world, one faithful step at a time, reminding us that even when hope seems buried beneath impossible weight, love is still listening, still waiting, and still leading someone safely home. If Ranger and Klieber's story touched your heart, please like, subscribe, and share this video with someone who believes that loyalty, kindness, and hope can overcome even the darkest moments. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next true inspired story.